Hey everybody, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. The lights were hot, painted walls, a future made of plywood, wires, and careful optimism. George Takei stood on a soundstage in Los Angeles waiting for the next take of Star Trek. He wore a uniform that imagined a world driven by reason, cooperation, and progress. Between scenes, he waited quietly, listening for his cue. Waiting was familiar for George. Because long before he stood under studio lights imagining the future, he had stood beside his parents as they shut down a business they were no longer allowed to run. He was 4 years old when the government decided where his family could live, where they could work, and whether they were allowed to earn a living at all. Their dry cleaning business in Los Angeles didn't fail. It was erased. Not by the market, by law. Decades later, Takei would become known for playing Sulu, a character who explored new worlds. But his earliest lesson came from watching how quickly the rules of the real one could change. So what happens to commerce when legality overrides ownership? How fragile are property rights when fear reshapes policy? And on February 19th, 1942, did the United States quietly show how fast businesses can disappear when the government redraws the map? From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain the stories that changed business forever. Every date on the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, February 19th, that story takes us to 1942, when the market was told to move. By 1942, the United States was rapidly reorganizing its economy for war, and that reorganization touched nearly every industry at once. Factories shifted to military production, shipping lanes tightened, labor was redirected, and the federal government began exercising emergency powers that most businesses had never experienced before. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order itself was brief and intentionally broad. It didn't name Japanese Americans. It didn't outline camps. It didn't mention businesses or property. Instead, it authorized the military to designate exclusion zones and remove anyone to them that they considered a security risk. That lack of specificity mattered, because once exclusion zones were declared along the West Coast, the consequences became immediate and concrete for Japanese American business owners. Grocery stores, farms, fishing operations, service shops, and pretty much all small manufacturers were given days, sometimes only hours, to shut down. Leases were abandoned and inventory was left behind, and operations frozen without clarity about whether reopening would ever be possible. These businesses were not symbolic or marginal. They were deeply embedded in local economies, supplying food or labor and services that communities depended on. Demand didn't disappear. Customers didn't leave on their own. The businesses didn't fail in any traditional economic sense. Participation was simply made illegal, and the market adjusted around that absence. The speed of that removal compounded the damage. Families were allowed to bring only what they could carry. Business records were left behind. Equipment was sold quickly, often at a fraction of its value. Inventory spoiled or was seized, and loans remained due. Insurance policies offered no relief. Banks didn't pause obligations, and courts didn't intervene in real time. From a business standpoint, this wasn't just interruption. It was erasure of continuity. Markets depend on memory. Customers return because the relationship exists, or credit works because trust has been built. Even short disruptions can permanently change who gets to participate, and this disruption removed owners entirely while allowing the rest of the system to keep moving. And that reason is why the temporary framing was so damaging. Because while the policy was described as provisional, the market wasn't. Competitors stepped in, supply chains rerouted, and new relationships formed. By the time the order was lifted, many former owners were returning to markets that no longer had space for them. Now, it's important to understand, this wasn't nationalization. The government didn't take over businesses and run them. Instead, it removed the owners from the marketplace and allowed private actors to reorganize around their absence. When legality changed back, the market didn't reverse. Years later, George Takei would return to this moment, not to dramatize it, but to document its mechanics. In his memoir, They Called Us Enemy, he describes how his family's dry cleaning business disappeared, not because it was unsuccessful, but because it was no longer permitted to exist. And it's important to understand, the book doesn't frame this as a singular tragedy, but as an example of how quickly normal economic life can be dismantled when policy changes without regard for continuity. That documentation exists because the market never corrected itself. Although the order was eventually acknowledged as unjust, and although apologies and reparations came decades later, the economic losses were not restored. Businesses weren't returned to their previous positions, and years of income were not recovered. Competitive ground lost during that removal was never regained. The lesson of that time is not that markets are fragile, but they are responsive to authority. When rules change suddenly, markets adapt quickly, and those adaptations can often outlast the policy that caused them. Temporary decisions can create permanent economic outcomes. And on February 19, 1942, when FDR signed Executive Order 9066, the United States demonstrated how quickly legality can override ownership and how long the economic consequences of that override can persist. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And do you want to actually understand business without the fluff or the buzzwords or the MBA language? Start by visiting us at businessdailypodcast.com.